I wish I could say I wasn't looking for him, but the truth was, I always knew the exact minute he walked through that door. The little bell above the bakery entrance gave a soft chime, and every morning after that, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. I kept my hands steady on the pastry box in front of me, even as my heart did that same humiliating thing it always did. Jump, then race, then go painfully quiet. He came in like he owned the air around him, tailored coat, dark gloves, a polished watch catching the gray light from the front windows. Not flashy, not loud, just impossible to ignore. He paused near the display case, eyes moving over the rows of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls, and I turned slightly away before he could look too long. It was a stupid habit, really, as if a half-second delay could keep me safe from being seen. "Morning," he said, voice calm and low, the kind of voice that made everything around it feel softer and more dangerous at the same time. I nodded and reached for the paper bag on the counter. "Your usual?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He gave the smallest smile, not enough to call it friendly, just enough to make my stomach twist. "If you still remember it," he said. Of course I remembered it. Black coffee, no sugar, one plain biscuit he never actually ate until he'd stood outside for a minute or two, staring at the street like he was waiting for a reason to leave. I slid the bag across to him and tried not to notice the way his gaze lingered on my hands. That was the problem with him. Nothing about him ever felt accidental. Even standing still, he made a room feel measured, like he was counting every sound, every breath, every small mistake. Outside, a cold wind pressed against the glass and rattled the little sign above the door. Inside, the ovens hummed, the espresso machine hissed, and the smell of butter and vanilla wrapped around us like a memory I didn't want to have. He took the bag, but didn't move right away. Instead, he looked past me, toward the small back table by the hallway, where 2 paper cups sat beside a coloring book and a half-finished puzzle. My pulse stuttered. I had left that there on purpose, hoping he wouldn't notice, hoping nobody would. "You're busy today," he said quietly. Not a question. I kept my eyes on the register. "It's Friday." That wasn't what I meant. I looked up before I could stop myself, and there it was, that unreadable expression I had spent 5 years trying not to study too closely. Not anger, not suspicion, something worse. Curiosity, the kind that didn't go away once it started. He shifted his weight, and for a brief second, I noticed the little scar near his wrist, the one he always seemed to cover with a cuff or a glove. He followed my gaze, then pulled his sleeve down a little more, as if the movement itself had been intentional. "You still work too hard," he said. I almost laughed, because that was exactly the sort of thing a man like him would say to a man like me, as if he had the right to notice, as if noticing meant something. Before I could answer, one of the paper cups on the back table tipped over, rolling just enough to make a tiny thud against the floor. He turned his head toward it. Then he looked back at me, slowly, too slowly, and I knew, with a cold drop of certainty, that today was not going to be like the other mornings. I did not answer right away. The room had gone quiet in that strange, delicate way that only happened when someone important had entered and everyone else had unconsciously adjusted themselves around him. I could still hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft buzz of the overhead light, the small rustle of paper somewhere near the register, but it all felt farther away now, as if the air itself had shifted to make room for his attention. He was still looking at me, not in the obvious way people looked when they wanted something, but with a kind of careful focus that made my skin feel too warm. It was unsettling. It was also impossible to ignore. I reached for the fallen cup, my fingers brushing the floor before I straightened it, and set it back on the table. "Today is just busy," I said at last, because it was the safest thing I could say. Some mornings are like that. He watched me the entire time, his expression calm in the way of someone who had learned how to make calm look natural. "And some mornings," he said, "feel different." My pulse gave a small, traitorous jump. I hated that he could say something so simple and make it sound like a warning. Or maybe not a warning. Maybe something else. I could not tell, and that uncertainty was what bothered me most. He glanced toward the front counter, where the line had finally thinned, then back at me again, as if he had already decided that whatever he had come here for could wait a little longer. That was new. He never waited for anything. Not in the way he stood, not in the way he spoke, not in the way people around him seemed to move aside, without even realizing they were doing it. Yet now he was lingering, and I was starting to understand that his silence was not empty. It was deliberate. Behind us, the morning had gone on pretending to be ordinary. Someone at the front asked for a refill. The espresso machine hissed. A chair scraped softly across the tile. But inside my chest, everything had gone very still. I could feel the weight of his attention like a hand resting just beyond my shoulder, close enough to notice, not close enough to call it a touch. "You do that," he said quietly. I looked up. "Do what?" "Act like you are not watching anything when you are watching everything." His voice was calm, almost amused, but there was something beneath it that made me want to step back and step forward at the same time. I forced myself to keep my face neutral. Maybe I just noticed details. A faint curve touched the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, not quite anything I could name. "Then you noticed me." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. They landed between us with enough weight to make the entire room feel smaller. I should have said something clever. I should have joked, deflected, changed the subject, done anything normal. Instead, I stood there with my hand still resting on the table edge and my thoughts moving too quickly to catch. Because yes, I had noticed him. I had noticed the way he always seemed composed even when he was tired, the way his voice dropped lower when he was thinking rather than speaking, the way he never looked around a room as if searching for approval. I had noticed more than I wanted to, more than I had planned to, and now he knew it. He took a slow breath, then turned his head slightly, as if listening to something I could not hear. When he looked back at me, his expression had shifted into something quieter, more contained. "Come with me," he said. It was not a command. It was not a request either. It was somewhere in between, and that was somehow more difficult. I stared at him, certain that I had misunderstood. "What?" "Just for a minute." His gaze flicked toward the back hallway, then returned to my face. "I need to speak with you where it is quieter." The sensible answer was no. The sensible answer was to ask why. The sensible answer was to remind him that he was standing in the middle of my workday and that I had things to do, customers to serve, a life that did not stop because he had decided something. But his eyes were steady, and the look he gave me was not impatient. It was patient, which was worse. Because patience meant he expected me to come. It meant he believed I would. The thought unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I set my palms against the counter for a second, grounding myself in the cool surface, then nodded once. "Fine," I said, though my voice came out quieter than I intended. His eyes shifted, just slightly, like he had been waiting for that exact answer. "Good," he murmured. And then he stepped aside to let me pass, as if he were opening a door I had not yet realized was there. I followed him through the side hall, my steps measured and careful because the entire situation still felt unreal, as if I had agreed to something I did not fully understand. The farther we moved from the front counter, the softer the sounds from the bakery became. The steady hum of the ovens, the bell over the door, the murmur of customers asking for cinnamon rolls and coffee all faded into a low, distant backdrop. Here, in the quieter part of the building, the air felt different too. Less warm, less familiar, more intimate in a way that made my shoulders tighten. He noticed, of course. He noticed everything. "This way," he said gently, and led me to a small room that looked more like a private office than anything else. It had a narrow table, 2 chairs, a shelf lined with recipe books, and a window that overlooked the alley behind the shop. It was plain, but it felt safer somehow, like a place where hard conversations could happen without an audience. I stopped just inside the doorway and folded my hands together to keep them from shaking. He did not sit right away. Instead, he stood near the window and looked out for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. That alone made me nervous. Men like him did not usually hesitate. When he finally turned back to me, his expression was calmer than before, but there was still something guarded in it. "I do not want to pressure you," he said. "I only wanted to speak somewhere we would not be interrupted." I gave a short, uncertain nod. That sounded reasonable. Almost too reasonable. "You could have said that outside," I replied, trying for lightness and failing. His mouth shifted, almost into a smile. "You would have said no." I could not argue with that because it was probably true. The silence between us stretched, and I became aware of every small detail at once. The clean scent of espresso on his coat, the faint trace of rain on his sleeves, the way he kept his hands at his sides instead of crowding me. He was trying, I realized, trying to be careful with me. That should have made me relax. Instead, it made something ache inside my chest because carefulness from a man like him felt rarer than kindness itself. "Earlier," he said, You looked at me as if you already knew something about me. My breath caught. I looked away toward the shelf of books, buying myself a second. I do not know what you mean. I think you do. His voice was still soft, but there was an unmistakable focus in it now, like he had found the thread he had been looking for and did not intend to let go. I forced myself to meet his gaze again. It was a mistake, because the moment I did, I felt that strange pull return, the one that had been haunting me since he first walked into the bakery. It was not attraction exactly, not something so simple. It felt older than that. He was looking at me like he was trying to place a memory that kept slipping just out of reach. "There is something familiar about you," he said quietly. My heart stumbled. I had not expected him to say it so directly. For a second, the room seemed to shrink around us. People say that sometimes, I managed. They do not always mean anything by it. "I mean it," he said. And then, after a brief pause, he added, "Your face, your voice, even the way you stand when you are unsure. It feels like I have seen it before." I swallowed hard. If he had only known how many times I had stood in front of a mirror and wondered whether anyone would ever recognize the truth I had spent years hiding. I had spent so long building a life that looked ordinary from the outside. Early mornings, flour on my hands, a careful routine, a quiet apartment, a son who had become the center of my world. I had worked hard to keep the past sealed away. And yet here he was, standing a few feet from me, speaking as if the past itself had found a way to breathe again. Before I could answer, he stepped closer, not enough to crowd me, but enough that I could feel the energy of him shift into the space between us. "You do not have to tell me anything you are not ready to say," he said. "But I would like to understand why this feels like I have been searching for you without knowing it." The words landed heavily, because they were too close to something I had been trying not to name. I looked down at my hands, then back up at him. He was waiting, not demanding, waiting. And for the first time in a long while, I was not sure whether silence was still the safest choice. He was still standing there, calm and attentive, as if he understood that pushing any harder would only make me retreat. The quiet between us should have felt awkward, but instead it felt strangely measured, like the pause before a door finally opens. I let out a slow breath and looked toward the window where the late afternoon light was fading over the street. The apartment was warm, filled with the faint scent of bread cooling on the counter and the soft hum of the old refrigerator. Ordinary things. Safe things. The kind of details I had once clung to as proof that my life had finally become my own. But his presence unsettled that balance in a way I could not ignore. It was not just that he looked familiar. It was that he looked careful with me, as if he had already decided I mattered before I had given him any reason to think so. I folded my hands together and tried to steady my voice. "I did not disappear to hurt anyone," I said quietly. "I left because I had to build something stable for my son and for myself. There was no room for mistakes." He nodded once, slowly, like every word I offered was something he intended to protect rather than challenge. "Then I am glad you chose what kept you both safe," he said. "Whatever happened before, it does not change that you are here now." That answer caught me off guard. I had expected questions, suspicion, maybe even frustration. Instead, he gave me something I had not prepared for. Understanding. It made my chest tighten in a way I did not like, because understanding was far more dangerous than anger. Anger could be defended against. Understanding could slip under the walls I had built and sit quietly in the center of them. From the other room, I heard my son laughing at something on his tablet, the sound bright and unaware, and the familiar ache of protectiveness rose in me all over again. I glanced toward the doorway, half expecting the moment to feel normal just because I wanted it to. My son had not yet come back into the kitchen, but his presence changed the entire shape of the room. Everything I did now had to pass through that one question. Would this keep him safe, or would it disturb the life I had worked so hard to protect? The man across from me seemed to sense that shift in my expression. His gaze followed mine toward the hallway, then returned to me with a gentleness that almost made me laugh at myself for having doubted him. "He is important to you," he said. It was not really a question, and I did not answer it. I did not need to. My silence said enough. He lowered his voice. "I can see that you have carried everything alone for a long time. I am not asking you to trust me immediately. I only want the chance to prove that I am not here to take anything from you." The words were simple, but they landed like a promise. In my chest, something old and guarded stirred uneasily. I had spent years learning how to move through each day without waiting for rescue, without expecting kindness to last. Yet here he was, not offering pity, not demanding explanations, only standing still in the middle of my careful world as if he intended to learn its shape rather than disrupt it. I finally looked at him fully, letting myself see the details I had been trying to avoid. The way he held his shoulders relaxed but ready. The tired line around his eyes, as if he had not rested properly in days. The faint crease between his brows that softened whenever he looked at me, like a memory he could not quite place. There was a familiarity there that I could not explain, and the not knowing was beginning to press against my thoughts from all sides. If he truly had been searching for me, then perhaps I had not been as invisible as I believed. Perhaps the past had not stayed buried at all. Perhaps it had only been waiting for the right moment to surface. My son's footsteps approached the kitchen, small and quick, and I felt myself straighten instinctively. Instinct took over, as it always did. I reached for the counter, for the routine, for the ordinary motion of wiping away a trace of flour that was already gone. But before I could speak, the man gave me a brief, respectful nod and stepped just slightly aside, as if making room for both my child and my choice. That small gesture said more than a dozen speeches could have. He was not trying to force his way into our lives. He was waiting to be allowed in. And in that moment, with my son about to enter the room and my own heart suddenly less certain than I wanted it to be, I realized the hardest part was not whether I remembered the past. It was whether I was ready to let the present change because of it. By the time my son reached the kitchen, the room had already settled into a fragile kind of peace. He came in carrying his worn little backpack with both hands, his cheeks pink from the cool air outside, and immediately his eyes found the stranger standing near the counter. He did not speak at first. He only looked, then glanced at me, as if silently asking the question he always asked whenever someone new appeared in our home. I gave him a small smile and lowered my voice. "This is the man I told you about," I said gently. My son's expression shifted from caution to curiosity in the way only children can manage, honest and unguarded. The man bent just a little, making himself less imposing, and introduced himself with calm patience. He did not crowd the room. He did not reach too quickly for trust. He simply waited, letting my son decide how close to stand. That single choice mattered more than I expected. I saw my child studying the man's hands, his face, the careful way he held himself, and I understood then that children notice everything adults try to hide. They notice kindness. They notice fear. They notice when someone is pretending, and they notice when someone is trying. My son set his backpack down by the chair and climbed onto the stool beside the counter, still watching the man with alert, thoughtful eyes. "Do you like baking?" he asked after a moment, his voice small but clear. The question surprised me, but it surprised the man even more. For a second, his expression softened into something almost amused, almost relieved, as if he had been given a bridge instead of a test. "I do," he answered honestly. "I am better at eating it than making it, but I would like to learn." My son considered that with solemn seriousness, then gave a tiny nod, as if approving the answer. It was such a simple exchange, and yet I felt something in my chest loosen. Not completely, not enough to call it peace, but enough to let the air move again. I turned back to the counter and began gathering the ingredients I had set out earlier, trying to focus on the familiar motions. Flour, sugar, eggs, the measured rhythm of ordinary tasks. But even as I worked, I was aware of him in the room, not as a threat, not even as a question now, but as a presence that was waiting for its meaning to become clear. He did not interrupt. He did not demand attention. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and asked if there was anything he could help with, careful to keep his voice steady and low. I almost said no out of habit. I almost protected the space around me the way I always had. But my son was already watching, and before I could retreat into caution, he pointed toward the bowl and said, "He can crack the eggs." The man blinked once, then looked at me with quiet surprise. I should have smiled sooner, but instead I found myself nodding, because refusing would have felt stranger than allowing it. He moved to the side of the counter and took the eggs with unusual care, as if they were something precious. There was something almost disarming about the seriousness with which he handled such a small task. One by one, he cracked them cleanly into the bowl, and my son let out a little approving sound that nearly made me laugh. It was the smallest thing in the world, and yet the room changed because of it. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough for the shadows to step back a little. As he handed the empty shells to me, our fingers brushed for the briefest moment, and I felt that same quiet awareness return, steady and impossible to ignore. He looked at me then, not with pressure, not with expectation, but with the kind of patience that makes a person feel seen without being cornered. "I know this is not simple," he said softly, only for me to hear. "I know I am asking for time." His honesty startled me more than any grand promise could have. I looked toward my son, who was now stirring the batter with complete concentration, and I realized that the shape of my life was already shifting in ways I had not planned. Not because of a sudden confession, not because of some dramatic turn, but because a man had entered our kitchen and chosen, from the beginning, to make room for the both of us. By the time afternoon settled over the house, the kitchen had been restored to a soft, lived-in calm, the kind that made every sound feel gentler than it had before. Sunlight moved slowly across the counters, catching on the clean dishes, the folded towels, and the little flour dustings my son had managed to leave behind despite his best efforts to help. He was sitting at the table now, with a small bowl of strawberries, carefully sorting the sliced pieces by size as if they were important treasures, while I stood at the sink rinsing off the mixing bowl and trying to quiet the strange feeling that had followed me since our conversation earlier. It was not fear exactly. It was not relief either. It was something more uncertain, something that lived in the narrow space between being guarded and being open. He had offered no grand speech, no demand, no pressure. He had only stayed, and somehow that had made the air between us feel heavier in the most delicate way. When I turned, I found him at the doorway, sleeves rolled to his forearms, one hand resting loosely against the frame as he watched the two of us with a patience that seemed almost careful. "I am going to check the garden light before it gets dark," he said. His voice was calm, practical, easy to live beside. "And I brought back the spare bulbs you said were out." It was such a simple thing to say, and yet it landed with the quiet force of someone paying attention. Not just noticing what was broken, but noticing what would make the day easier. I nodded and thanked him, though the words felt too small for the steadiness in his presence. My son looked up from the strawberries and asked if he could help carry the bulbs, and he smiled in that softened way he had only begun to show around us, the kind of smile that made his face feel less distant and more human. "You can hold the flashlight," he told him. "That is the most important job." My son accepted this like a serious assignment, his chest lifting with pride as he hurried over to the drawer to find the little flashlight we kept for power outages. Watching him, I realized how quickly the household had changed around a person who knew how to leave room instead of taking it. The silence was no longer empty. It was beginning to feel lived in. Outside, the late afternoon wind moved through the trees with a low, steady murmur, and I found myself thinking about all the years I had spent bracing for the wrong kind of attention, for the kind that arrived like a storm and vanished just as fast. I had learned how to recognize intensity. I had learned how to survive it. What I was not prepared for was this slower kind of certainty, the kind that did not demand a reply in the same breath. He returned a few minutes later with dirt on one hand and a loosened screw in the other, as if the simplest tasks had become part of some larger effort to make the place feel safer. My son trailed behind him, proudly carrying the flashlight even though the sun was still high enough that we barely needed it. "The light is fixed," he announced, as if he had been part of the repair itself. "And the wire was loose, but now it is not." "That is excellent reporting," he said, and I had to look away for a moment because the tenderness in that exchange felt too easy to name and too dangerous to ignore. Dinner was still hours away, but he asked if we minded him staying for tea, and before I could overthink it, my son was already dragging out the chairs with the confidence of someone who had decided this was now a normal part of the evening. We sat together beneath the warm, fading light, the three of us with cups that steamed faintly in the cooling air, and the conversation moved in small, safe circles. School, weather, the strawberry crop from the market, a broken hinge on the pantry door that he offered to fix tomorrow. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would echo in a headline. Yet I felt each ordinary sentence settle into me like a stitch closing a wound I had not admitted was still open. When my son leaned against me halfway through his tea, sleepy and content, I rested a hand on his hair and looked across the table. He was watching us with a softness that made his earlier patience seem even more deliberate, as if he had already understood that belonging was not something to force. It was something to earn through consistency, through gentleness, through showing up again and again without asking to be rewarded for it. The sky outside had turned gold at the edges, and I found myself thinking, not for the first time, that the quietest changes were sometimes the ones that altered a life most completely. By the time the sky had fully deepened beyond the kitchen window, the house had settled into that rare kind of peace that makes even a simple evening feel earned. My son was already half asleep in his chair, his cheek tilted toward the table, his small hand still wrapped around the edge of his cup, as if he did not want the moment to end. I lifted him carefully when his head dipped too far, and he stirred just enough to press closer to my shoulder before relaxing again, trusting me in the way children do when they feel safe. He watched us both with a patient kind of tenderness, finishing the dishes without being asked, then setting them aside with the sort of quiet attention that made me notice how often he was already thinking about what we needed before we had the chance to say it out loud. There was something steady in him that evening, something almost grounding, as though every small act was a promise made in plain language. When I carried my son toward the living room, he followed with the folded blanket in his hands and placed it over the back of the sofa where my son liked to sleep when the nights turned cool. It should have been such a small thing, yet it landed in me with the force of something larger, because I had spent so long bracing for the moment when kindness would be taken back or turned into a debt. Instead, he kept offering it without ceremony. No grand speech, no demand for thanks, just the simple, repeated choice to make our home easier to live in. Later, after my son had drifted fully asleep with one hand curled around mine, I stood in the hallway and watched him quietly check the pantry door hinge with the same practical focus he brought to everything. He knelt, tested it, and made a note on his phone to bring the right tools tomorrow. The soft yellow light from the lamp caught the side of his face, making him look less like a stranger who had stumbled into our lives and more like someone who had always belonged at the edge of them, waiting for the right moment to step closer. I leaned against the wall and realized the feeling in my chest was no longer caution. It was the beginning of trust, cautious but real, built from the kind of consistency that cannot be faked for long. The night outside was quiet, the kind that carries no urgent news, no sudden turns, only the distant hum of a neighborhood settling in for sleep. And yet inside our little house, something had shifted again. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough that I could feel the shape of the next day already changing around us, softer at the corners, less lonely than the one before. By the next evening, the house felt different in a way I could not have explained to anyone who had not lived through the earlier silence with us. The same rooms were still there, the same narrow hallway, the same little kitchen with its worn counter and the soft hum of the refrigerator, but the air had changed. It was warmer now, touched with the quiet rhythm of routines being built one careful choice at a time. Our son was sitting on the floor with a stack of picture books spread around him, turning each page with the solemn focus only a child could bring to something he loved. He looked up whenever he heard footsteps, smiling easily now, no longer watching the door, as if he expected the world to leave again without warning. Seeing that kind of comfort settle into him made something loosen inside my chest. It was not dramatic. It was not sudden. It was simply the steady relief of realizing that a child can feel safety before he can ever name it. Our guest had come in early, carrying a small canvas bag with the tools he had promised and a paper sack from the bakery down the street. He set both on the table, then paused just long enough to glance at the room, as if checking whether we still needed him here. He always did that, always looked for the edges of what might be helpful instead of assuming he already belonged. That habit should have kept him distant, but it did the opposite. It made him feel dependable. It made him feel real. While I poured coffee, he bent down beside our son and helped him fit two puzzle pieces together, showing him how to rotate one gently until the shapes matched. The child gasped as if he had witnessed a miracle, and the sound of that delighted little breath filled the room with such pure happiness that I had to turn away for a moment. In the kitchen window, the late afternoon light leaned gold across the sink and the edge of the table, catching the quiet details of the life we were building. A mug left unwashed, a crayon mark on the chair leg, the little jacket hanging by the door. None of it was polished, Yet all of it felt more precious than any perfect room could have been, because it held evidence of people living honestly inside it. When I looked back, our guest was watching the child with an expression so soft it seemed almost surprised to be there. Not smiling exactly, but close. As if he had expected to remain an outsider forever and was only now beginning to understand what it meant to be trusted by a small, open-hearted person who did not care about old mistakes or complicated histories. I set the coffee down and asked if he wanted sugar, and he nodded, then thanked me in that low, careful voice of his. There was something in the way he said thank you that always reached me. It carried the tone of someone who had once been denied ordinary kindness so often that he still treated it like a gift. He took one sip, nodded to himself, and then went back to work, checking the loose hinge on the back door, tightening a cabinet knob, and looking over the small repairs he had made the night before. Each task was tiny on its own, but together they felt like proof that our lives did not have to depend on grand gestures to become whole. They could be rebuilt in the smallest units possible. A fixed latch, a shared meal, a child laughing at a puzzle, a quiet evening without fear. I watched him move through the house and thought about how strange it was that trust could grow from such simple things. Not from promises, not from declarations, from showing up, from noticing what needed attention, from staying long enough to prove that care was not temporary. And as the sun lowered beyond the window and the room filled with that gentle amber glow that makes even ordinary walls look almost sacred, I understood that this was the part of the story no one could fake on command. The part where people stopped bracing for loss and started making room for a future they had not dared to imagine before. By the time evening settled fully over the house, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt lived in, softened by the kind of ordinary sounds that only belong to a home where people are finally safe enough to be themselves. A cabinet door closed in the kitchen. Water ran briefly at the sink. Somewhere down the hall, a small laugh rose and faded, followed by the gentle patter of feet against the floor. I stood for a moment in the doorway and let all of it reach me at once. The warmth, the steadiness, the unspoken certainty that no one here was waiting for the other shoe to drop. That had once been our whole existence, did not it? Counting each hour for signs of loss, reading every pause as a warning, living as if joy had to be borrowed and returned before dawn. But now even the quiet had changed. It was no longer the silence of strain. It was the silence of peace taking root. He looked up when he noticed me watching, and there was a softness in his face that would have seemed impossible to the man he had once been, the man who thought endurance meant locking every feeling away. The years had taken us through too many winters to count, through misunderstandings, distance, grief, and the long ache of rebuilding what had been broken. Yet here he was, leaning one hand on the counter while the other reached automatically for the mug waiting beside him. And somehow that single gesture held more truth than 1,000 dramatic vows ever could. He had learned the shape of our life the way someone learns a language by living inside it every day, through repetition, through patience, through the willingness to keep trying even after mistakes made the path feel uncertain. And I had learned, just as slowly, that being loved well did not always look like being swept off your feet. Sometimes it looked like a warm plate set down without comment. Sometimes it looked like a blanket adjusted around tired shoulders. Sometimes it looked like a child carrying a half-finished drawing into the room and announcing with complete confidence that it was a picture of home. The house had become a record of all those small mercies. The repaired latch on the front door. The shelf in the hall where the little one now reached for his books. The corner by the window where a blanket had been left folded because someone knew I liked to sit there in the late afternoon light. Nothing about it was grand, and that was what made it feel so permanent. Grand things could be performed. Grand things could be announced. But this could only be built. I remembered the earlier years when every decision had seemed to arrive wrapped in fear, when even kindness felt like something that might disappear if we touched it too hard. We had not understood then that healing was not a single turning point. It was 1,000 quiet returns. A hand extended again after hesitation. A conversation resumed after silence. A meal shared after days of emotional distance. A room rearranged to fit the life we were actually living instead of the life we had been told to fear. That was the miracle of it. Not that everything had become perfect, but that we no longer needed perfection to feel grateful. We had enough. We had more than enough. We had each other, and the child who moved between us as freely as sunlight, and the unremarkable, beautiful proof that a family could be made stronger not by forgetting what it had survived, but by learning how to live after survival. When he finally crossed the room and stood beside me, his shoulder brushing mine in the easiest, most familiar way, I felt the last of that old tension leave my body. He followed my gaze toward the window where the amber light had begun to deepen into evening gold, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. There was no need. Some truths did not require sound. Some truths only needed to be witnessed. And what I witnessed then, standing beside him in that warm and quietly transformed room, was the life we had once believed would never be ours, steady, imperfect, and whole. Not because it had been handed to us, but because we had chosen it again and again until it became real.